because here's something that might bother you. And it's the idea that the image on your retina is compatible with an infinitely many possible worlds, but we only ever perceive one, and it's usually the correct one. And that should be impossible. It should not be something that we're able to do. So today, we're going to take a look at why psychology accidentally made perception unsolvable, and then how ecological psychology tried to fix it. So this is, again, just another step in our understanding of the human mind, that wonderful mechanism that we have, that system that we have, that might be in a fractal type of organization. And that is why you can have thoughts and then think about having thoughts, and then think about thinking about having thoughts, and then think about thinking about having thoughts. But eventually you kind of lose the plot. You can't go higher or can't go lower in that hierarchy. So it might be a kind of fractal organization that allows us to have consciousness. But an end result of that is that we actually don't really have consciousness. We just kind of feel like we have consciousness. So again, just another thing to kind of toss into that mixer of what is the human mind that we've been doing this semester. And then today, we're going to go and take a look at a approach to perception that had massive impact, massive implications, massive success in the field, and yet for some reason has just not been championed by the perceptual psychology mainstream community. So if you take a look at many textbooks on cognitive psychology, they'll mention ecological psychology and they'll mention Gibson, the founder of ecological psychology, but it's usually a single paragraph or maybe half a page that's dedicated to this approach. And as you're going to see today, that seems to be massively underrepresented. So today we're going to see why the monumental shift of realizing that we are organisms in an environment. And because of that, there are certain realities and truths that we live in, such as we typically move in an environment that perception ignored, that perceptual research ignored. And to show you how artificial some perceptual research has been, I found this article, and it's a methodological article from the behavior research methods and instrumentation. And this is what is known as a byte board. So this, we'll just pull that contraption up a little bit. That contraption there is known as a byte board. And it is oftentimes used in perception research. And it's used in perception research to keep a person's head and their eyes as still as possible. So literally what you would do is this little part of it up here, you would bite down on that during the experiment. You would put that in your mouth and bite down on it. And then while you were perceiving things in the experiment, your head would be immobilized and you would have no motion. And they would do experimental research on perception under those circumstances. And things like that and approaches like that led us down a very dangerous and unproductive path. And it was only when we said, hey, a byte board is something that we just do not experience. And a motionless head is something that we just do not experience. And as I even say, do not experience, my head is bobbing back and forth. So we're going to see again the implications of putting perception into a very artificial situation that made certain perceptual abilities that we have literally impossible, and how taking them out of those unnatural situations solved those particular problems. But before we get to that, we do have one last little section that we need to cover on signal detection theory, just to put a pin in it and wrap it all up in a nice tight little bow. So we're going to finish up with those real world applications and implications. We're going to take a look at that study on power and biases and sexual interest. And importantly, we're going to apply what it found to concrete suggestions and guidelines in terms of how to improve society in terms of interpersonal relationships. So we want to make sure that in our society we have hits and correct rejections, and we want to minimize as much as we can misses, but most importantly, those false alarms. So just as a real quick recap, Kunstman and Maynard in 2011, they did an experiment that was a staged manipulation. So participants came in and they were told that they were going to work with a partner on a task that simulated making decisions in organizations. But the actual experiment was about biases in sexual interest. So the participants were male and female. They were undergraduate psychology students. They were placed in opposite sex groups, and that part was staged. So there was actually no partner. The partner was a videotaped confederate, but the actual subjects were either placed into a power position or they were placed into an equal position. The power position was told that they would have final say in the decisions and they would be able to decide how the rewards were allocated. So was it going to be 50-50? Was it going to be 90-10? Was it going to be 70-30? Those in an equal position were not given any of those power dynamics. They did not have final say in the decisions, and the rewards were going to be split 50-50. Prior to interacting, or prior to being told that they were about to interact, these subjects would watch a 2-minute video of their opposite sex partner. And then they answered questions about that partner and about that partner's sexual interest. And importantly, it was that partner's sexual interest in them, the person that was viewing the video. So we have subject sex and we got power condition. We had male subjects, female subjects. They were placed in leader positions or equal positions. So we have 4 conditions. We have conditions where it was a male subject that was placed in the leader position. We have male subjects placed in an equals position. We have female subjects placed in a leader position. And we have female subjects placed in an equals position. And each of those subjects would then watch a video of an opposite sex partner, in quotes, because again, this was a staged manipulation. There was no actual partner. And they would ask questions about the partner's sexual interest in themselves. So questions such as, I could see this person having romantic or sexual feelings for me. So based on this 2-minute video that I just watched, I think that person would be interested in me, or I believe that person would not be interested in me. So based on this 2-minute video that I watched, I could see this person wanting to ask me out on a date, or I don't think this person would want to ask me out on a date. So they would rate those questions on how interested they believed the person in the video would be in themselves. All right, so the basic question that they wanted to answer was that if you have power over a person, does that affect your expectations of sexual interest? Does that affect how much you perceive that they are interested in you? So let's take a look at each of these conditions in turn. So again, remember I asked you to try to predict what it is that is going to occur. Are leaders going to have higher rates of expectation than equals, or is there going to be no difference? Or maybe equals have higher rates of expectation of sexual interest? Do males have higher rates of expectation of sexual interest than females? Or is it equal, or is it vice versa? And then finally, if there are effects, do the effects of being a leader affect males more, or do they affect females more, or is it an equal effect across those two sexes? All right, so hopefully you made those predictions. Try to remember them right now, and let's see if your predictions actually match up with what was found. And we're going to start with the power condition. So in the power condition, this is ignoring subject sex. So you take all the males, you take all the females that were leaders, and you average their results. And then you take all the males and all the females that were equals, and you average their results. And we're going to see numbers here for their scores on expectation of sexual interest. And what we need to know to interpret these is that the higher the number, the higher the perceived sexual interest. The higher they believed, or the more they believed that the person in the videotape would want to date them or have a relationship with them. So in this case, we have the score for the equals. They had an expected sexual interest score of 2.44. However, for the leaders, they had a higher score, and that score was significantly higher. So what that means is that statistically, we have evidence that this is a real difference. This is not due to chance, and that higher number actually indicates that leaders had higher expectations of sexual interest. And it's important to remember that these groups were assigned randomly. So the individuals in the leader group are just like, on average, the individuals in the equals group. The only difference being that they were placed in a position of power and the equals were not. And when they were placed in a position of power, the person that they were looking at in that videotape seemed to them to be more interested, more receptive of sexual interest in a relationship. So that was the leader versus equals. Yep. We probably do. I don't offhand. Yeah. So you're talking about the effect size of this? Yeah. That's an excellent question. I don't have that on hand, but that's a very interesting question to ask. So for anybody wondering, maybe about what effect size might be in any sort of psychology research, especially, a lot of times you're just interested in theoretical differences. You're just interested in, is this one bigger than this one because it proves a theory, right? So a lot of times, especially in cognitive psychology, we're looking for those milliseconds of difference, right? Like in change blindness, because that actually proves one theory is correct versus another theory. But then you also have more applied type research. So this difference here is theoretically important, but it's also important in terms of how big a difference is this, because we would want to apply this to the real world. So if that difference there was a huge difference, right? If 2.44 versus 3.15, that's a massive difference in expected sexual interest, then you would want to take this and you would want to say, yeah, let's go apply this everywhere. Let's spend the money. Let's spend the resources. This is important. Well, let's say that it proved a theoretical point, but the difference was minuscule, right? We're talking about one extra person asking somebody out of 100, versus the equals condition. In that case, it's theoretically important, but applied is not so much. So that's one of the reasons why typically, if you are looking at psychology research, they will report p-values and effect size, because you want to know, is there a difference? That's the p-value. And then you want to know, how big is that difference? How important is that difference? That's your effect size. So I don't have that off the top of my head, but that is a good thing to consider. Okay, so we have the actual, in this case, theoretical difference. Leaders have higher expectations of sexual interest. We then take a look at males versus females. And we just ask, do males have higher expectations of sexual interest? Or maybe do females have higher expectations of sexual interest? So in this case, we take all the male subjects, regardless of whether they're leaders or equals, and we put them all together in the male group. And we take all the female subjects, regardless of whether they were leaders or equals, and we put them all together in the female group. So now we're just looking at males versus females. And in this case, the expected sexual interest for both groups was exactly the same. So it was not true that men have, there's your p-value if you're interested, it's not true that men just in general have higher expectations of sexual interest. It's not true that men just in general perceive evidence when they're looking at the way that a certain person acts. In this case, what they found was that from that 2-minute video, men and women had exactly the same amount of expected sexual interest. So then finally, we have the possible interaction. Is it something that might affect male leaders versus female leaders differently than it affects male equals versus female equals? So it's quite possible that power has an effect on males, for example, where if you're in a high position of power, your expected sexual interest rises. But if you're in an equal position of power, your expected sexual interest actually decreases. So on average, it stays the same, but it increases for power, decreases for equals. Whereas maybe for females in power, no change. Females that are equal, no change. So it stays the same for completely different reasons. So maybe there's an interaction. Maybe power affects males and females differently when we're looking at expectations of sexual interest. So this is when you compare all four conditions across each other. And what they found was that male and female in the equal condition, they were the same as each other. And males and females in the leader condition were the same as each other in terms of expected sexual interest. So this is one of the parts that was surprising. It didn't matter whether you were male or female. Power increased perceived sexual interest. So now what the question is what does this do to the signal detection curve? But before we get that, anybody have any ideas of why power would increase expectations of sexual interest? Because again, remember that they are looking at the same videotapes. There's no difference in the videotapes. It's just whether you perceived that you had power over an individual made you perceive that the things that they said and the way that they acted indicated to you that they would be more sexually interested in you. So what do we think might be operating there? What's the mechanism? What does power do to you?
Perhaps it triggers some like predatory nature.
That humans have to maybe pursue their
Biological needs.
Okay, so power might activate some sort of predatory nature that at the very least makes you more likely to pursue your biological needs, right? So that would actually be a really, really interesting theory to test, because if it's something that activates your biological needs, what else could we test it on? What are some other biological needs? Food, for example. So you could do this exact same experiment, and instead of saying, "Oh, okay," instead of having a video, 2-minute video of the person that you're supposed to be working with, show them a 30-second commercial of a burger, and ask them, "How tasty do you think that burger is?" And what we should find, if your theory is correct, that it just instigates this kind of predatory behavior to fulfill our needs, the people in power should rate that burger as looking way more delicious than the people that were equals. So things like biological based needs, like food, like shelter. You could show them Zillow offerings, show them houses, and say, how much do you think this house is worth, right? Anything that's kind of a basic biological need, if that's what triggers it, then that would be a good way to test if it's just a general thing that here is being applied to possible sexual encounters, but is just a basic need. Any other things that might change in person? Yep.
Maybe power just makes an individual feel more self-confidence.
So maybe power makes you feel more self-confident? Okay, and how would that trigger expectations of sexual interest?
Confident in your, I guess, sexual attraction to others. That you'll have roughly think, oh, in that person might have sexual attraction towards me because I confident that I am sexually attractive.
Exactly. So maybe being placed in a position of power just raises your confidence. Maybe that's just something that is an innate reaction that we have. As soon as we're put into a position of authority or position of power, we just in general feel more confident. And when you feel more confident, basically you start to think of yourself in better terms. And if you're thinking of yourself in better terms and you look at somebody and they ask you, would that person want to date you? And you're feeling confident and you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm amazing. I'm very competent. I feel like I'm really good looking right now, right? Because I have this little boost of confidence. Of course, that person is going to want to date somebody like me, right? Because I'm an amazing person. Look at all this confidence I'm feeling right now. Versus if you're not feeling confident, then you might say to yourself, well, I don't really feel like I have my life together, and I don't really feel like, I'm looking my best right now. So that person, why would they want to date me? Right? So it might just be a boost in confidence. So all of these things are possible mechanisms, and it might not it's important to know which of these mechanisms are operating, because again, it's something that will allow you to affect these sorts of dynamics if you know what is actually causing that change in the power conditions. All right, so let's move on to the kind of final application of this to signal detection theory. And again, this is one of the things that was really sort of surprising, this result, that it is power. And this kind of helps to understand why oftentimes in the Me Too movement, men were the ones that were being accused and called out on their behavior. But as the movement continued, we had a lot of females starting to be called out for their particular behavior. And you will notice if you go through it, it was always somebody in a position of power, right? With all of the men that were accused, it was always somebody like Harvey Weinstein, who was a big time producer who could completely ruin a young actress's career, right? It was always somebody like alleged, I can't remember who of these is alleged. It was always somebody in a position of power, like Asia Argento. She was in a position of power. She was a powerful director. She had connections, right? It was never somebody, the stories never came out where they said, well, you know, I was working on a movie and the person working at the craft service table, you know, made sexual advances at me and sexually harassed me. Those accusations just never occurred because it seems to be that the source of these false alarms is this difference of power. So to just wrap this up, let's take a look at some of the implications for what this tells us that we can actually do. Because what we want to do is we want to get rid of the false alarms, right? The false alarms are where the problems are. So what can we do to get rid of these false alarms? So we'll take a look at two different approaches, that being sensitivity training and that being workplace policies and cultural shifts. So this is going to be kind of aimed at how do we get rid of this in the workplace? So that people can work in an environment where they don't feel like they continually have to fend off false alarms. So one possible method that has been tried, has been employed, and is still being employed, is sensitivity training. And the idea behind sensitivity training, it's literally there in the name. It's training your sensitivity. So what it's saying is that we're going to take this situation here. Right? We have a workplace, and we're going to take this situation here where there's a lot of false alarms in our workplace, and we're getting a lot of sexual harassment complaints, and it's not a good environment for people to work in. So we want to get rid of those false alarms. So what we're going to do is we're going to train sensitivity. We're going to increase sensitivity. And what that means is we're going to take those two distributions and we're going to give the people the skills to move those distributions far apart. So we're going to teach them about, you know, what is and is not good evidence, right? What will allow you to make correct rejections and allow you to make hits. We're going to separate those and increase the sensitivity of your perceptual system through this sensitivity training. However, this has not been very successful. And one of the reasons for this not being very successful comes from this research by Kunstman and Maynor that shows that just having power increases your expectations of sexual interest from other individuals. I put that wrong. Increases your perceived expectation of sexual interest from other individuals. What that means is that you can increase sensitivity like this, but a person who's in power will still see the same behavior and take it as evidence that that person is interested in them. They will still see that 2-minute video and take it as stronger evidence that that person is interested in them. So what that means is that when you put a person into a position of power, the evidence doesn't change. That 2-minute video is exactly the same, but their criterion has to move. It has to move lower. And that's why they're thinking that people are more interested in them based on the exact same evidence. And if that criterion goes lower, those false alarms just pop right back up. So you can have sensitivity training, but it will not work if power is allowing that criterion to just continue to go lower and lower and increase those false alarms. So what do? Well, you can take a look at other policies, such as workplace policies and cultural shifts. So you might say to yourself, all right, Kunstman and Maynard told us that this is just the reality of the situation, right? And it's not that these people in power are all of a sudden somehow turning into horrible individuals. It's not that they're all of a sudden, just thinking to themselves, well, I can get away with anything. The Kunstman and Maynard research is actually saying that these people in power are walking around and they're seeing interest everywhere they look, right? They're seeing interest from just about everybody that they interact with because of the effects of that power. So you still want to get rid of the false alarms. So one thing that you can do to alleviate this are workplace policies. And you can simply say, we do not allow intimate relationships between people who are employed by us. So basically, if it's a worker that works here, do not ask them for a date. Do not show them any sexual attention. That is our workplace policy. And what that policy does is it moves the criterion all the way over here. And it basically says the only evidence you have to worry about, is does that person work here or do they not work here? If they work here, no sexual attention. If they do not work here, go ahead, give sexual attention, right? And that will get rid of all those false alarms. So now we have nothing but correct rejections, which is what we want. And we have nothing but misses, which is not costly. And that is one of the policies that has been more proven to be effective than sensitivity training. Now, the last thing that I will mention is that what this does, and what some people have pushed back on, is that this actually gets rid of all these hits. So hits are something that we want. And if you adopt this policy, then you get rid of all these hits. So the question is it worth it? Number one, which most companies I think have said, yeah, it is. And then the other question is, where do those hits go? Because we still want people to meet each other. We still want consenting adults to get into long-term relationships, to, fulfill their needs and have all the wonderful societal benefits. We still want those hits. So we need something to fill that gap. So if it's not going to be at the workplace, excellent. But the question then becomes, well, where else can you go to achieve those hits? All right. And the last thing we're going to take a look at is the cultural shifts. And that is, again, from this Sassler and Miller article, which is a gold mine of just this kind of research here. So you might remember this is where we had the rueful woman that kept getting shot down. But one thing that we didn't take a look at was about couples and how they met. And we talked about the 11 couples in the sample that had a formal date at the beginning of their relationship. And 10 of those couples, it was initiated by the man. So in 10 out of 11 times, the relationship was initiated by the man. The male had to say, I see evidence that this person wants to be asked out, and they went and they made that decision. However, that's only half of the story, because there was another 6 couples, and those 6 couples met on the internet, and no clear pattern regarding gender and initiation emerged from that group. So what that means is that in this newer form of dating, in this kind of newer opportunity, newer landscape that is going to attract the younger, generation, the younger generation of dating, there was no clear pattern. There was no males predominantly initiating or women predominantly initiating. And this is a cultural shift, because what we had before is we had 2 different gender roles with 2 very clear skill sets, right? So for males in our society, they were taught that what you need to do is you need to detect signals. And what you do not need to do is you don't need to give evidence, right? You're not the one that's going to get asked out. You're not the one that needs to convince, individuals to ask you out on a first date. you don't have to give evidence. You just need to detect signals. And then for women, they were told by our society, you don't need to detect signals. You need to give evidence, right? That's why you have entire articles in women's magazines about how to dress, how to flirt, how to, make yourself more desirable. That's why one of the most popular, I think it was books and movies about relationships in the last 20 years was He's Just Not That Into You, which is basically saying you are not detecting signals, right? So that's the old model. And when you have something like this, whatever you need to do in our society, you will spend time and you will spend effort in getting good at it. Whatever you don't need to do in society, you will not spend the time, not spend the effort to get good at that. So men in our society were getting really good at trying to detect signals, but they did not give any effort in trying to give evidence. And women in our society did not put any effort into detecting signals, but they put lots of effort into giving evidence. So you have a society where males detect the signals and they ask women out 10 out of 11 times, they're going to ask out for the first date. But online, in online dating, those responsibilities are shared. So now in online dating, you have men who need to detect signals, but also they need to give evidence. So you need to know how to make your profile picture, how to put in a description, how to, properly interact when somebody starts messaging you. And the same thing with women in the more modern times of dating. Now they also have to detect signals and they also have to give evidence. And that's why in those 6 couples that met online, there was no difference between who initiated and who did not initiate. There was no rueful woman in that online dating scene in this particular study. All right. And then finally, just because I always like this example, just one last example of cultural shifts. So this is from about 10 years ago now. So at the height of the Me Too movement, somebody suggested what was known as the ROC test. So the ROC endorses the ROC test for preventing sexual harassment and shares it on what used to be Twitter. So a woman named Anne Victoria Clark had a simple hack for men to be able to determine whether or not they should approach a woman and ask her out. And her hack was simple: treat all women like you would treat Dwayne The Rock Johnson. And it just got the stamp of approval from The Rock himself. So she suggested that, and The Rock said, cool to see the big response to this from Anne B. Clark. When you men approach women, just think of me. And basically the idea was that simply offer them the same respect, admiration, and healthy dose of fear you'd offer anyone who could completely destroy you should you deserve it. And the key word there is that healthy dose of fear. Because if you're dealing with The Rock and you have to make that decision of, do I give The Rock sexual attention or do I not give The Rock sexual attention? And you are getting evidence from The Rock. Let's say that The Rock does not want you to approach him. The Rock does not want your sexual attention. And you decide, hey, you know what? Rock's not into me. He doesn't want my sexual attention. That's a correct rejection. And what happens during that correct rejection? Nothing. You get rock smolder and you're fine. Everybody's fine. It's a great situation. On the other hand, if you're in a situation where The Rock does want sexual attention and he's looking at you and sending signals your way and thinking, oh my goodness, I can't wait until they come over here and ask me out, and you decide not to give sexual attention, that's a miss. And what's the result of a miss?
What just happened?
I'm sure it doesn't happen to him very often. So he would probably be confused, but again, low stakes, low cost. All right, this one was hard to edit, and I had to go through it, so we all have to go through it now. Let's say that The Rock is giving evidence that he wants sexual attention, and you're looking over at him and saying, you know what? Yes, I'm going to go give The Rock sexual attention. So if he wants sexual attention, You give them sexual attention. That's a hit. This is the outcome. Hopefully a little better than that. But everybody's happy. Everybody's good at having it, getting kind of what they wanted. That was difficult to edit and difficult to watch. But the big one, and the one where it says the healthy dose of fear is when the rock does not want sexual attention. And you decide to give the rock sexual attention. And what is the outcome of that?
Uppercut.
Yeah, potentially, because he's a big guy. So that's what they're basically saying. They're basically saying, if you were to approach the rock, the cost of those false alarms would be high. So what do you do if the cost of false alarms is high? Well, if you can't increase your sensitivity, which is very difficult to do, you would basically say, hey, I don't want uppercut, so I'm going to take that criterion and I'm going to move it over there. And the rock is going to have to flirt with me massively and give me much more evidence before I'm going to go over and say, hey, rock, sup? I guess, I don't know. I don't know what line you would use for the rock. You go up there and say, let me just say you're welcome. I don't know. I can't think of anything right now. Anyways, any final thoughts, comments, things on signal detection? Okay, so hopefully you saw just how powerful signal detection can be. And you can just see how you can apply this and use it to make decisions, and analyze policies and guidelines and ways that you can intervene in any sort of yes-no decision. So it's not just lights in the lab, it's relationships, it's grad schools, it's any yes-no decision that you need to make. You can use signal detection theory. All right. So now we're going to go on to ecological psychology. So this is a new section that we're going to take a look at. So on the schedule for the remainder of today, we're going to start off with the backstory. And this is psychology's backstory. And this is the starting out a little sad, but then very triumphant story of psychology trying to fit in with the other sciences. So we'll see exactly what I mean by that. We'll see what Helmholtz and others tried to do to help psychology fit in with the other sciences. And then we're going to see what J.J. Gibson did when he came up with ecological psychology. And the ideas of texture is going to be the first concept that we're going to introduce in ecological psychology. All right, but first, psychology's backstory. So psychology as a science, if you were to compare the timeline of psychology as a science to the other three major sciences, to physics, chemistry, and biology, psychology is a little baby. And by the time psychology came on the scene, you can imagine that the cool kids, physics, chemistry, and biology, they were already in a kind of tight-knit group. And along came psychology and said, hey, I want to be a science too. Can I join your group? Can I be part of it? So just to kind of give you a history of this, physics began as a formal science in the 16th and 17th centuries during the scientific revolution. So that's when you had Copernicus's heliocentric model of the solar system. You had Galileo doing his pioneering work with telescopes. You had Newton's laws of motion. They came in the late 17th century. That's when physics kind of established itself as, hey, we're leading this scientific revolution and we're really good at figuring out what's going on in the world. Chemistry, on the other hand, emerged as a distinct science in the late 18th century. And that happened a lot because of the work of Antoine Lavoisier on conservation of mass. That was kind of what, kicked it. And it shifted from alchemy, which had been around way longer, to a more systematic experimental approach, right? So that was the late 18th century. And then biology became a independent scientific discipline in the early 19th century. So in the early 1800s, term biology was coined by Carl Burdach. Schleiden and Schwann, they proposed cell theory. Charles Darwin came out with his theory of evolution. So we had all of that going on, and that was the early 19th century. And then 100 years goes by, and along comes psychology. And psychology emerged as a separate scientific discipline in the late 19th century. And William Wundt opened the first experimental psychology laboratory in 1879. William James published the Principles of Psychology in 1890. Psychology was late to the science party. And what psychology did was they basically, I'm going to anthropomorphize psychology a little bit. Psychology basically said, hey, we want to be taken seriously. We want to get into your group. We want to be part of the in-group of sciences. We don't want to be part of the out-group of mysticism and magic and all those other sorts of pseudosciences. We want to be on the in-group with you guys. What do we need to be on the in-group with you? And just like any sort of teenage clique or group, where it's basically like, well, you got to listen to the music we listen to. You got to kind of dress like we dress. You have to do your hair like we do. You got to use the slang that we use if you're going to fit in. That's basically what psychology did. So Helmholtz, one of the first major contributors to perception, right? One of the first major contributors to that field of psychology, he was a physicist and a physician. So he was coming from physics, he was coming from biology, and he made contributions in lots of different scientific fields. But when he came to psychology, he basically thought to himself, what has worked in my past? I'm a physicist. I'm going to take physics and I'm going to apply it to psychology. Physics is great at determining what is going on in the world. So let's just take the concepts that we have in physics and we're going to apply it to psychology. And I will say nothing wrong with taking existing stuff and trying it out. But as we're going to see, it was disastrous in terms of what it meant for perception. So to show you why it was disastrous, one of Helmholtz's biggest contributions to perception was based on his realization that your image on your retina is ambiguous. So this is easily shown. So if you have something in the real world, that object in the real world is sending light to your eye. And that light comes in a particular pattern, and that pattern falls on your retina and it stimulates your receptors. And that information, that pattern gets analyzed and basically leads to your perception of the object that is out there. What Helmholtz realized is that that pattern is ambiguous because this particular pattern that this eyeball is looking at right now could have been caused by that object, or it could have been caused by that object, or it could have been caused by that object, or it could have been caused by that object, or it could have been caused by an infinite number of different objects, all of them completely different realities. And yet somehow in our perceptual world, we perceive the one reality, and that one reality is usually correct, right? We looked at illusions before, but for 99.9% of your perception, you're usually correct. You're usually able to determine which of those four, and in reality, infinite number of objects, is the actual object that exists in the real world. So Helmholtz knew this, and his solution to this problem was what he called the likelihood principle. And the likelihood principle states that the object that we perceive is the one that is most likely to have caused the pattern of stimuli that we have received. So we apply a sort of probability estimate of what is the most likely of these situations to actually have caused the pattern on our retina. So this is one of the problems that he proposed. And then what people quickly realized is that when you have infinite possibilities, it makes the concept of likelihood completely impossible. So when you have infinite possibilities, likelihood is no longer a real concept. So if you need a little bit of kind of more convincing on this, so if you take one, right, one of these is true. And let's say that we determine that one of these is the actual, we give the third square from the left, that was the one with the highest likelihood. But we have an infinite number of squares that are possible. What is any number divided by infinity? Anybody? So if you take 10 and you divide it by 5, you get 2. If you start increasing the number, you take 10 divided by 10, you get 1. You increase what you divide by, you take 10, you divide it by 100, you get 0.1. You divide it by 1,000, you get 0.01. You divide it by 10,000, you get 0.001. You divide it by infinity, you get 0.000000000 all the way down. Literally any likelihood divided by infinity possibilities is a likelihood of 0. So to say that we could choose the one of these that is the most likely is a mathematical impossibility because they are all equally likely, and the likelihood that each of them have is 0. So the chances of us taking a look at infinite possibilities and choosing the right one enough times that we actually can survive in this world, that is absolutely 0% possible. So Helmholtz, I believe, I don't know if he was aware of this problem. Other people were aware of this problem. So just to kind of give you one way that this was potentially solved. So this is George Berkeley. He was a philosopher back in the 1700s. And he proposed that the solution to this, the solution to the fact that the world and the pattern on your eye is ambiguous and it could be infinitely different numbers of things, but we actually only perceive the one thing, he took that as proof of God. He said that in this reality, the pattern that we're observing is ambiguous. And there's an infinite number of things that the real world could be. And yet we only perceive the true real world. And the only way that could happen is if some divine being was controlling what we saw, and that had to be God, and that's proof of God. So he took this situation here as proof that God has to exist because somehow we solve this impossible to solve problem. And the only thing that could solve an impossible problem, according to George Berkeley, would be God. All right, so what was it that caused Helmholtz to do this make this an impossible problem? Because the important thing is that it's not impossible. We do it. So there has to be a method that we can use to do this. But what was it that what was the mistake that he made? What was the wrong step that he took in order to get to this impossible dead end? And the wrong step that he took was that he took ideas from physics. He took ideas from things that he knew about. Because again, he was a physicist, and he said, let's take those existing concepts and we're going to take them and we're going to apply them to psychology. So when I do physics, I have planes in space. I have mathematical equations that can tell me where those planes are and where they are in space. I have functions and idealized surfaces and basically mathematical models that tell me what is out there. And I'm going to start with that as a concept and a framework, and I'm going to try to understand perception using it. And as it turns out, it was just the wrong way to do it. It was just the wrong way to start. So if that was the wrong way to start, what might be a possible right way to start? So just in case it's still a little bit abstract in terms of what is going on here, just to kind of give you an analogy, and we'll give you a callback to one of the first classes that we went to. This perceptual problem of how do we see the world out there, Helmholtz This perceptual problem, you can think of it as the train problem with the bird flying between the trains. And Helmholtz tried to solve it like this, and that was trying to solve it as a distance problem. He represented it the wrong way. And then Gibson came along. Here he is right there. And he said, no, 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 no. It's actually a time problem. Let's try to re-represent perception in a way that maybe we can solve it now, right? So Helmholtz tried to represent it using one series of representations, planes and mathematical formulations and physics tools. And Gibson came along and said, well, that's not working. We're spending all this time trying to calculate out how our visual system is working. Maybe we need a new representation. And he said, maybe that representation is ecological psychology. So what was his starting point? Oh, and incidentally, before we go on, I very much admire Gibson for two reasons. I might be a little bit biased because I had a PhD supervisor that supervised my PhD journey. His name was Dr. John M. Kennedy, amazing researcher. His supervisor was Gibson. So Gibson's like my grand supervisor, and I got good feelings for him because the PhD, one of the PhDs that he produced, had a huge and really positive influence on my life. But also Gibson is, I think, one of the best scientists ever to exist in this world, because he is probably the one scientist that was most willing to be wrong. And he was totally fine with somebody coming to him and saying, hey, your theory, it doesn't make sense because of this. And rather than getting defensive and saying, well, no, this is my theory and my reputation, and I can't have you disparaging me, so I'm going to bury you in the literature, and then we're going to, call into question all those kinds of political machinations that happened in the history of science. Gibson was basically like, oh, okay, why am I wrong? Yeah, that's a good point. Let's fix it. Let's try, to do something else. And that's one of the reasons why, and you're going to see this when we talk about some of his work, when you reference Gibson, you don't just reference Gibson, you have to reference a year, because Gibson 1970 is completely different from Gibson 1979, because there were multiple times in his career where he just said, oh, okay, I got it completely wrong. Let's just start over. And I think that is just something that is missing from a lot of scientists. And it would make science a much better place. All right. Back to ecological psychology. What was Gibson's starting point? So his starting point was that the goal of perception is the guidance of adaptive action and not mental inference from physically caused sensation. So he began with the idea that the reason that we are able to perceive at all, the reason that we have any of these experiences in our mind that we call perception, is only to guide adaptive action, is only to allow us to move through this world and take action on the things in this world, to get food, to get shelter, to navigate correctly. That is the goal of perception. That is the starting point. That is why it exists. So everything in perception is going to be tied to that guidance of adaptive action. So what does that mean? Well, according to Gibson, perception was direct, non-inferential, and it was from information gathered from the environment. So we're going to go over what direct means in more detail in the coming classes, but non-inferential. That means that we didn't have hypotheses of what was going out there. We didn't assign likelihoods, like Helmholtz was suggesting, to what is the most probable perception or probable outer reality that is out there and existing. It's non-inferential. We perceive information from the world that we don't have to think about. We don't have to interpret. The information is enough. You don't need to infer further from that information. So very bottom up. If we want to apply, terms from our previous classes, this is a very bottom up theory. And you have information that is gathered from the environment. You have evidence, information that you actually perceive, and it's taken from the environment around you. So how is this different than what came before? Why is this a shift that is actually really, really important? Well, the widely accepted framework for perception research came from physics. So as we just saw with Helmholtz, he was a physicist. And again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm, ragging on Helmholtz here, but he did what anybody would do. He said, "Hey, I'm really good at physics. I'm going to use physics. Let's try this with physics." It's just that it was wrong, but it was held on to for a long, long time. Again, because psychology was a new science and we wanted to hang out with the cool kids. So we did some of the cool kid things that maybe we weren't supposed to. Anyways, the widely accepted framework from physics was that we had bodies in space because that's what physics dealt with. It dealt with bodies and space. And what we perceive are objects in space. And this was an abstract mathematical approach. So if anybody here has ever taken a physics course, usually you deal in abstract mathematical terms. Usually you deal with a weight that has an idealized center of gravity that's at a point, and you're dealing with a plane. And for this purpose, we're going to assume that there's no friction and there's no air resistance, right? It's a very abstract mathematical type of approach. And importantly, it's passive. And what I mean by that is that you don't need an actual person or organism to understand perception if you're using the physics framework, because perception is just perceiving those bodies in space, right? And that passive aspect of physics, that is why when I was showing you that bite board earlier in the class that immobilized individuals so that they couldn't move their heads, basically that was saying we're going to make you as passive as possible so that we can get to the true nature of perception, right? We're going to remove all this action that you're taking because perception is passive and we need to get to that true core perception, which is that passive perception. So Gibson said, all right, well, we tried this and it didn't work. We tried this approach and it just hasn't, been very fruitful. We tried this approach and it gave us an impossible problem to solve. So what can we do? Well, we can try a new framework. And we can say, hey, instead of bodies in space, what we have is we have mediums and we have substances and we have surfaces. So what is a medium? A medium is anything that you can travel through. So air is a medium. And I don't know about you, but I have never been in a place where I was doing perception and I didn't have either air around me or water around me. So I have always lived my life in a medium. I've either been in air or I've been in water. We have substances. Substances are the things that we have in our environment. And they have width, and they have length, and they have depth, right? Those are your substances. They exist in the medium. And then we have surfaces. And surfaces are where your substance and your medium meet, right? So we have tables in this class. And the tables in this class are in contact with the air, right? And that place where the tables are in contact with the air, that's a surface. So a medium and a substance coming together, that's a surface. Two substances coming together, that's another surface. Two mediums coming together, water and air, that's another surface. But we have mediums, substances, and surfaces. So now that we no longer have objects in space, we can't perceive objects in space. So what do we perceive? What we perceive is we perceive surfaces in a medium. So again, we perceive these surfaces in the air, the atmosphere that we exist in. Or if you're underwater diving, you perceive surfaces in the water that you are existing in. We have never perceived surfaces in a vacuum. That is probably less than 1 in a billion people have ever actually done that. This last one is this third one is a massive one. Instead of an abstract mathematical approach, Gibson said, perception is not done in an abstract mathematical universe. Perception is done by an organism in an environment. So you cannot have perception without an organism. something needs to be perceiving. And you can't have perception without an environment. There has never been an organism in existence that did not exist somewhere, right? You're in an environment always. I have never not been in an environment. My entire existence has been in an environment. And then because we got organisms in an environment, that means that perception is not passive, it's active. And one thing that we're going to see in the coming lectures is just how many problems in perception get solved as soon as you allow the organism to move. As soon as that organism is active, many of these impossible perceptual problems become things that can be solved. All right. So let's see this in action, and then we'll wrap it up for today. So we have these things. We have mediums, we have substances, we have surfaces. They're not idealized objects in space. They're not perfect planes that exist only mathematically. So what is one of the outcomes of this new framework? Well, one of the outcomes is that we are going to have access to information such as texture. So texture does not exist in the physics framework, but texture exists in the ecological psychology framework. And let's see what that does to our impossible solution. Okay, so let's take a look at this situation here. So we have a child, and they're looking out of a window. And out of that window, they see an idealized abstract plane. So this is something that would mathematically exist in a physics mathematical model. So it's a perfect plane, perfectly smooth, same color everywhere. The question is, what is this child looking at? So if you take a top-down view, there's your child, there's the window, and the question is, what could they possibly be looking at so that looking out their window, it would look like what we have there on the left? And this is basically the Helmholtz problem restated, because that pattern of what we see on the left there, that could be caused by a wall that looks like this, and it's at this orientation. It might be that wall that this child is looking at, or it might be that wall that the child is looking at, right? It's big enough to fill the entire window, but it's slanted away from this child. Or it might be this wall that the child is looking at. And any of those possibilities and any possibility in between is compatible with that pattern that we see on the left, because that's what we have in an idealized physics world. However, in the real world, we live in a real environment with real things in it that have texture. So as soon as you put texture in, then all of a sudden we know exactly the orientation of that wall. There's enough information there so that our minds don't have to pick between different likelihoods. They can just say, oh, that wall is parallel to the window. And I can tell because there's texture on that wall, repeating elements that occur in nature, and that gives me information that that wall is parallel to the window. And as you'll realize once it's kind of stated explicitly, we have texture everywhere in our world. So there's texture in bark, there's man-made texture in things like towels and tiles. Fabric has texture, wood has texture, fur has texture, rocks have texture. So if you're ever on a rocky stretch of land, that's texture. You're walking all over texture. And I'm just realizing texture is one of those words that's hard to say over and over and over again. But anywhere you look in the world, there's going to be texture. So a sunflower field has texture. And what does that mean for our perceptual system? It means that there's information in that texture that we can use to solve the problem that Helmholtz posed that made psychology and perception impossible. Because when you have a real world, a real environment, then you have patterns of light coming from one area of that environment that is different than patterns of light coming from other areas of that environment. But as soon as you take away the reality of an environment that we live in, and you start to say, well, what if we mathematically model this and we take away all the texture and all that we have is an idealized plane? Well, your information is gone. So it makes the problem impossible. This problem is possible to solve. This problem is impossible to solve. This problem is an organism in an environment. This problem is bodies in space and idealized mathematical formulas in space. Again, wonderful for physics. I'm not ragging on physics at all, but not good for psychology. So that was just an example of one of the first moves that Gibson did when he was recreating this framework, just to point out the importance of texture for perception and the fact that it does exist in our environment. And we are going to see exactly why that was so very important, and importantly, how our perceptual system uses that when we continue on with ecological psychology next time that we meet. So that's all that I wanted to cover for today. Any questions, comments on anything about ecological psychology so far? All right, so we are going to continue our journey down this road, this textured road in the real world next time we meet. But other than that, we're done for today.